I've tried to respond to the kind of way that we've had different kinds of presentation, as I took to do, taking seriously the idea of communities. And Emma's used the straightforward paper format, and I wasn't imaginative, or I was too lazy to think about breakup groups. So what I've kind of done is, this is a paper in 3 parts, and we're going to break and have discussion between each part. That's, desperation is the mother of invention, really. Except it does speak to the fact that this isn't a paper, because this comes out of a project, and a project in a technical sense. That's a Leverhulme-funded project that isn't just time off for me. There's a postdoc, a graduate student, and we've been building a database. And what that has meant for the first 2 years, and we're in the second year for me, is it's been largely mentoring others, and we know what a fraught and dubious position that is, but also building a database and harvesting information. So I feel I've been actually at the level of empirically gathering things rather than thinking about them. And that's been actually something of a liberation, because it does grant you the time to think, I am going to think about this in my own time. That's been compounded by the fact I've had this year off to write a book on 1790s print culture and radicalism, which there are a couple of overlaps with, but it's been very different. And so what I'm going to do today actually falls into 3 parts. The first is a brief account of the project, which is the Leverhulme-funded project on literary clubs and societies in the period 1760 to 1740s, and an explanation of one particular area of interest for the project, that is book clubs and reading societies. I'll pause there for any questions you have about that specific formation, and then I'm going to just present some archival evidence in relation to a particular reading society in Bristol. And this basically was scuba diving into an archive and coming out. I've tried to say some things about it, but I'm interested in it for itself. Right. I'm interested in it actually as a piece of creative community, as a piece of creativity. It is the community is the creativity, is one way of thinking, which I think speaks to some of the things Jon was saying before. And then the third is a discussion of this context in relation to Coleridge and Southey in Bristol in the 1790s. Now, one reason I'm very glad to have the breaks is I want to make it very clear the second part is not being presented as the context for the third part, which is what we would often do in a literary paper. Okay, there are some connections. I wouldn't want to overplay them. I'm not, and my interest in the material in the second part is an interest in this formation in itself. The fact that we know some things about the larger context in Bristol because of Coleridge and Southey scholarship is not the reason for doing it. Right. So I'm hoping to make it less of a paper and more of a workshop by having these 3 breaks, and I've asked Dave to give me a nod when so I'll speak, there'll be questions, and I'll try and go on to the second part. So let me talk about networks and improvement. In terms of the remit of the project, improvement is understood as a complicated word that speaks to the drive to accelerate the production, circulation and accumulation of capital that would imply a Marxist critique, but also other tendencies in tension with and even antagonistic to such processes. I think often certainly in the academy, improvement is a negative word now. We think of moral improvement, blah blah, it's a conspiracy and stuff. I want to kind of acknowledge those aspects of the word, but not make them the only freight it bears. Similarly, literary is given a broad definition of the project related to the diffusionist print as well as to the narrow modern sense. But we're also interested in the role of these clubs and societies in sorting out an idea of the literary into the 19th century understandings of the term. So it's quite important that this goes from 1760 to 1840. The date is less interest in the beginning and the end than getting over that 1800 point, which is usually made the marker, as it was for Peter Clarke's seminal book on clubs and societies in general. 1800 comes, the other side of it you've got built institutions, the division into disciplines, societies that will divide up the literary from physics, from chemistry. I wanted to have a project that goes over that line to see how messy those changes are. They are messy and they take place much later than is often expected. But I also want to see the role of these books and societies in actually themselves deciding what are the boundaries of the kind of thing, the kind of books they would look at. In order to do this, we built a database, and I don't even want to go there, but it has been built. We didn't ask for money for the database. Warwick, but not get this on from Warwick have helped us build the database. It's been a somewhat traumatic experience, but it's there. And one of the things some of you may be interested in putting data into it, membership names, names of clubs. The more data in it, the more useful it will be. And I can talk to you later about how you might do that. What do I mean by these clubs and societies? Well, we include everything from informal reading groups that might meet irregularly to discuss books and circulate their own manuscript writing. Many of the latter category often involve women writers. It's been, I think, said several times that the bulk of women's writing in the 18th century is manuscript writing, circulated in small groups. Through to formal book clubs and reading groups, which is sort of a mediated category, through to grander institutions like the Royal Literary Fund, and also things like the Literary and Philosophical Societies, the first of which was started in Manchester in the 1780s. These were more substantial groups, eventually at least. They often had their own buildings, rules and officers, and also published their own proceedings, whether in their own transactions, as with the Manchester's transactions of the Literary and Philosophical Society of Manchester, or via special relationships with periodicals. My relatively brief visit to the Newcastle Litville archive suggests they had a main line, as you might expect for this group of dissenters, to publishing in the monthly magazine. You could kind of guarantee you'd get your paper published. It's like having a head of department who runs a journal on the eve of ref. Dissent was crucial to both these institutions, as it was to many of the other clubs and societies. The Manchester Litville and the Newcastle Litville were both started by students of the Warrington Academy, Thomas Percival and William Turner respectively, and indeed both each made the other an honorary member of their own literary and philosophical societies, that type of a network. Often these more formal literary and philosophical societies grew out of the more informal book clubs and reading societies that I'm going to talk about today and discussed by David Allen in your reading. Indeed, Thomas Percival's, William Turner's proposal for the Newcastle Litville begins by the problem of getting access to books and even where to store them. And in fact, for 10 years they exist with a room in a coffee shop in Newcastle, and the building, which is finally set up, I think, in the 1810s, 20s, comes about partly from the problem of securing space for your books, as well as other things like a venue for lectures, etc. Now, there's a growing body of literature of book clubs and reading societies, most of it built on the work of the library historian Philip Kaufman. Basically put, the terms book club and reading society in the period are usually used to refer to gatherings that own books as a group. They usually had rules, sometimes entered into a minute book and sometimes even printed up, about the circulation of their books. Often a mechanism for suggesting new purchases, that is a suggestion book or whatever, a box that you could slip things into. And they frequently levied fines for late returns, etc. They usually met on a monthly or weekly basis and tended to keep the membership small enough to facilitate discussion. Allen suggests a maximum of about 25. Most examples that I've come across seem to aim for about 12 to 15 members if they aim for convivial discussion. I'm already pointing out one of the ways in which these societies were not like a library alone, in that they met in order to discuss and talk about the books. They weren't simply there to put books necessarily into circulation. The categories are usually subdivided further, although not always respecting the nomenclature I'm going to use. Library societies, to use the term used by John Marsh in Chichester in the 1790s, held on to their stock of books, and some of them actually developed into subscription or municipal libraries. Although one of my briefs with the David Allen article, he makes it sound as though that was always a prior intention, which I do not think is the case. Partly because you can see they often met to discuss the books. They weren't just buildings to allow people to read in or take books out from. Book societies, on the other hand, usually had a sale, often annual, sometimes to coincide with an annual dinner, which of course was a feature of most forms of 18th century conviviality. Most 18th century clubs and societies had an annual dinner. Around this kind of literary sociability, all kinds of ephemeras that... Oh, I knew this was going to happen. Do I just need to... Where do I click?
If you just left click, it should...
It's because of being a Mac user, I don't really have the concept of left clicking. Oh, there it is. I've got one too far.
You can use the back key on the keyboard to get back.
Oh, okay. Can you get this? Sorry.
Thanks.
This is really just to show you some of the kinds of...
We'll cut
just
this.
that one. Yeah. Apart from being an example of how bad a photographer I am in an archive, I've just found lots and lots of this kind of really interesting print ephemera. This is simply a card that's in the Warwick County Archive with the book club printed out for the year 1792, which dates the meeting. Yeah. These book clubs generated a lot of print of their own, of entirely ephemeral kinds. Or more interestingly, these are John Freeth of the Birmingham Book Club, which still exists, where he printed invitation cards to say this is the annual dinner, even the details of the times, as poems. And he was a well-known popular poet at the time. He printed books of ballads and songs, but he actually used the society feast and sale of books. He gives the dates and information in the form of a poem. So these book societies are surrounded by their own world of print that they generate. And as I said, the Birmingham Book Club still exists today, as do several of the other institutions I mentioned, like the Newcastle Litfield, the Manchester Litfield, the Leeds Litfield. Although many of them, I've said here, rose and fell like gnats in the summer. It's funny when you have a Keating impulse. There we go. Now, obviously the primary aim of the societies in both the forms I've mentioned was access to books. Printed by this time, by the 18th century, in greater volume than ever before, although still very expensive in real terms. Indeed, the book history evidence is that though there were more books, they actually increased in cost. We forget there was a takeover in book production. That doesn't necessarily mean they were cheaper. In these societies, they were usually paid for by subscriptions to the members. The musician Jon Mee, whose commitment to politeness John Brewer has written about, was not poorly off, but he was relieved when his library society started in 1794 to supplement the book society that already existed in Chichester. Chichester's not a big place. It's not a big place now. 1792-94, it's already got a book society and a library society, as well as other forms of bookish institution. In January 1795, he recorded in his diary, "On this day I finished Sullivan's View of Nature, which I had from the Library Society, from which and from the Book Society we were now furnished with as many books as we could get," i.e. I never need to buy another book, because I'm a member of both the societies in Chichester. Now the 1790s is often seen as a decade that ideological difference brought an end to the kind of clubbable world typical of the 18th century. It's one of the things Peter Clark implies in his book about clubs and societies. But actually, as you'll have already seen by some of the dates I've mentioned, there was actually a flourishing of them in the 1790s, and I've not entirely worked through how to make sense of that. This is a decade riven by ideological difference that seems to see an explosion in book societies of all kinds. The Moral and Political magazine of the London Corresponding Society, for instance, published a list of Scottish reading societies in 1797, urging its readers to follow their example as, quote, "an enlightened populace is the strength and pride of a free nation." And in 1806, Thomas Hardy, former secretary of the LCS, tried for treason and acquitted in 1794, donated a little stock of his radical pamphlets to the Mitcham Book Society. If any of you are members of that institution, it's still with these words: "I sincerely wish that it may prosper. Societies of that kind are calculated to diffuse much knowledge and information to the members who compose it when judiciously conducted." For him, I think the improvement offered by a book society was clearly tied to his programme of political reform. And it's worth adding at this point that book societies often contributed to the production of the knowledge they diffused, insofar as they frequently appear on subscription lists in the period. It's just a little factoid that I've noticed that book societies often appear in books that they then, in the subscription of books that they then take. So they're actually producing the thing they consume. In fact, the best example of this, I think, there's an urban history, which also flourished in this period, of, I think it's Tewkesbury, which ends by saying, and one of the signs of the growth and refinement of Tewkesbury, and Whitesworth wrote a book of this, that there's a book society that now flourishes in town. You look at the subscription list, and the book society, so there's a weird sort of circularity and self-evidence going on there, I think. Now, one of the things I think I gave you to read is the article in the monthly magazine for June the 1st, 1821, that William Sinclair discusses in his article. It's on what he calls book societies and literary institutions. Interestingly, it's so early, it's already deciding to write a history of such things. Now, in this article, it claims the first book society appears to be formed at Leicester about the year 1740. The article mentions the involvement of John Aitken Sr., later tutor and kind of headmaster of Warwick, with which the Litfields of Newcastle and Manchester were to have strong connections. The club was always certainly associated with the Academy Aitken round Kibworth, Leicestershire, around 1741 to 58. The botanist and physician Richard Pulteney was apprenticed as an apothecary in Loughborough around 1745 and set up as a surgeon in Leicester 1752. The article mentions both men as involved in the origin of this society, though in fact those dates don't work. Pulteney couldn't have been involved from the beginning, and I have some doubts as to whether the club described as a continuous entity anyway. David White, for instance, and others have drawn attention to Pulteney's involvement in a small group that used to meet to discuss literary and philosophical matters, including the Hosier John Coltman, called the Quadrumvirate in the 1750s. This group seems to have expanded to form what Catherine Hutton called a book club in the 1760s, and which we first get the mention of women family members attending. John Coltman's wife seems to have attended, as does Mary Read. So in a sense, that article implies that this book society beginning in 1740 has a continuous existence. I think it's actually a succession of different kinds of societies. But that's one of the things the database wrestles with. You know, at what point do you say this is a book society in Leicester and these are the dates, or do you start to identify it as a different entity? When they aren't named as such, do you just put book society at Leicester? And that's the sort of thing, that's the network nightmare about how to, what you name your nodes when they've got no names. Nor is there any reason whatsoever to think the society described by the monthly magazine was the first. In fact, it's a ludicrous suggestion. There's a society at Spalding set up to take in and circulate the Spectator in the 1710s. And this is, I think, that article is actually a spectacular piece of self-promotion by dissenters. It's in the monthly magazine, and what else would the monthly magazine say than the first book society was formed by dissenters? But it is typical of the kind of proximity that seems to have existed between dissenting communities and this sort of arrangement. There were various motives available for setting up book clubs, and they were not necessarily exclusive. Beyond the not always primary one of getting hold of books, there was the idea of the diffusion of knowledge, obviously important for Hardy and the London Corresponding Society in its relation to political reform. But for others it was to do with the improvement of scientific information, etc., etc. I've already mentioned the various town histories that appear so frequently in the late 18th century, which usually take book clubs as a sign of the spread of cultural politeness, which may have been a reason for starting them in the first place. A society of gentlemen in Exeter, another society that sprang up in the 1790s, involved Isaac Disraeli, Dr. Hugh Down and others. And it seems to be in this sort of self-conscious exercise, setting itself up to prove how polite the local town was. And it announced a possibly exclusive interest in what it called, a possibly exclusive appeal to what it called lovers of literature in the town. In 1796, the Society published its own collection of essays and poems, quote, that had been read at the stated meeting of the Society, originally united by private friendship. Now, possibly that's moving into a different form of organisation that wasn't about the buying and sharing of books, but it was about reading and writing and presenting to each other. But often the lines between those things are quite blurred. The Exeter Society justified reading out papers by members as a means of promoting conversation for those to whom it did not come naturally. I'm not quite sure that necessarily always works as a way of promoting conversation, to sit and listen to a paper being read out, as this paper may so be proved. It does seem the Society didn't own a stock of books, and the reading out of compositions and essays, but the reading out of compositions and essays was not uncommon in book societies that did. Interestingly, despite consecrating itself to the bond of politeness, as it put it in the preface to its collection, where opinions could be scouted in a friendly environment without rancour, the Exeter Society crashed and burned in a very public dispute conducted in the periodicals about the form of the sonnet. So they meet politely in a very self-consciously Anglican, genteel way to talk about literature. Within 3 years, they're bickering about what the proper form of the sonnet is in the Gentleman's Magazine, and they fall out. One of the things, quite interesting things about this is that the relationship, and this was also true of what I said about Newcastle, there's not much different distance often between the sociability in these clubs and societies and the periodicals. You know, things move very quickly into these sociable disputes into appearing in print, and the periodicals are very important to them. So, as I've already said, many town histories understood book societies as part and parcel of an open sociability within polite circles. The Baptist and Unitarian Joshua Tumlin celebrated the fact there were 4 book societies in his History of Taunton in 1800. The first was formed in 1766. Another more recently formed, quote, was confined to ladies, unquote. After dealing cards and dancing assemblies, William Dyke's History of the Antiquities of Tewkesbury, 1798, noticed, quote, But that which above all evinces the superior taste and good sense of the town and neighbourhood is the establishing a reading society, a certain criterion of elegant refinement. The historical member of the Devontown of Tiverton by the Baptist Martin Dunsford placed rather more emphasis on conviviality than refinement and celebrated the fact that, quote, many evening clubs and friendly societies have been likewise formed here for mutual enjoyment and recreation after the business of the day. And a note in the book to the word friendly explains that one of the societies most worthy of notice is the Book Society, formed in 1775, composed of 12 members of almost every sect, party, business and profession in Tiverton. So they prided themselves on being ecumenical. Dunsford prided himself on having been among the first members and promoters of these friendly and useful book meetings at each other's houses in rotation, as he puts it, for the choice of proper books and adopting convenient regulation. They essentially seems to have endlessly happy to talk about regulation. The idea of these book societies as places that allowed friendship to flourish, as places where rancour and ideological disagreement could be put aside, was a very powerful one in accounts of the period, strongly associated with the very idea of the literary. Even in practice, as we've seen with the Exeter societies, the outcomes are rather different and often to the point of schism. So there endeth the first chapter. So any questions? How am I doing for time, Master?
We've got about 4 minutes.
Okay. Quick. I can see my teacher in Felicity.
Sorry, Felicity does this still seem to hurt definitely, but no, I just wanted do you see any patterns emerging? I mean, it must be wonderful doing these what you call deep dives into the archives. There must be some principle that you're working on.
Well, we did. I did have a list of questions. One of which whether there was a sort of withdrawal from mixed spaces into the home or into more institutions after 1800, so that with the coffee shop meetings where that's supposed to be too open and porous and moving out, did things become more or less ecumenical? What about the role of women? What kind of spaces were women involved in? At first, it looked to me like there were a lot of women involved in very loose manuscript exchange circles, and I wondered whether they were going to be involved in book clubs in the same way.
Their own writings.
Yeah, I think manuscripts. I mean, it's sort of what Tim Whelan's done. Has done work on the Mary Steele Circle, the Cotman Circle in Leicester. They kind of circulate. I mean, some of them did publish as well, but they circulate their own writings. They often live in dispersed communities who only come together when their families visit, and those are networks formed by religious affiliation. So there's a Birmingham, Bristol, very strong one. The Leicester one's strongly affiliated with Birmingham and Bristol, I would say as well. Emma, so there's a very strong Norwich, Liverpool connection, Liverpool-Manchester connection. You can see those kind of movements where family visits, and at that point they will get together and circulate things, sometimes by correspondence. I wondered whether, I've got the impression that the more regular monthly meetings, which were heterosocial, possibly given to convivial, which is a word that can hide a lot of things, but I'm increasingly finding women do seem to be involved and mentioned as a
writing societies rather than...
That seems to be the case, but it doesn't seem to be. As we found more information, I don't think that is true. As I've said several times I think I've used this piece of evidence twice at least before now, but the Manchester Lit Phil, as far as I can see, is a purely male gathering, but they do have this early essay on the importance of female participation.
It's similar in Edinburgh, isn't there, in the 18th century? They talk about the role of women.
But then my graduate students found this piece of evidence, she says in a Leeds newspaper, saying that they're talking about women's presence and they're going to follow Manchester and allow women in. And sometimes it's a problem with the archive that if all you've got is a list of members, there are no minutes for Manchester. It may be women weren't allowed to be members, but women went, which is typical of the sort of conditional access to knowledge women often felt. So that's something I'm kind of interested in. As well as where these things took place, what kind of sociability took place, and then what kinds of books they read. The Birmingham Book Club, where I spent an insane morning photographing, has its list, as the list of books they own. So this material will allow you to see what kinds of things people read.
Can you say just a little bit more about what you seem to be putting in terms of regulation on the one hand, an obsession with forms of regulation, and on the other, there's kind of putting ideological differences to the side. So it seems to be a strange but fascinating mixture of flexibility and obsessive regulation.
Yeah. Well, so that's
I just wonder how you make sense of that.
Yeah. Well, sometimes it is. Sometimes it seems it is in order to create the conditions for freedom, so people can speak freely. So let's not talk about religion and politics. And sometimes by that they don't mean issues of, if you like, liberty. It's about let's not get caught up in theological debate. But there's a club in Norwich, there's a debating society, which is a long Latin name I can never remember how to say, where they debate whether religion and politics should be excluded. And their conclusion is, what's the point in having a debating society? You know, and that is the problem. If you're going to ban these two major topics, what's the point in meeting to talk about them? And most of the lit fields do have in their rules that religion and politics will not be discussed. But then it crops up again. I think there's in the Newcastle lit field, somebody puts their name down toward I can't remember what it is, but it's something obvious like rights of man or political justice, and there's a squabble and letters are written to the president. So there is this thing about what will keep the best conditions for us to meet equally and discuss. And then, but the problem is, if the cost of that is to exclude anything that's interesting, if you like, then so they're the energy, the force fields that are shaping the questions. I mean, that's not to say some groups are committed to certain sort of politics and are going to exclude a certain sort of thing. So.
Oh, just a comment relating to that. Obviously, that developed out of libraries, where libraries subscription libraries in particular, used to ban political or religious, even sometimes medical books, and I think there's probably some kind of continuation of the lit and films, and possibly, if you're thinking in terms of the regulation and looking at conduct books, and maybe there's some layer of kind of the way you meant to conduct yourself in the 18th century versus this regulation. But I was just quite interested in what you're finding about the sorts of membership of these libraries, and whether that's something that you're already looking at in your database, and when you're considering that. I mean, is it kind of middling sorts who you probably expect to see as members of these societies, or, I mean, throwing your links with friends societies, for instance, are we actually seeing maybe kind of some of the lower kind of classes being members and forming their own societies so that they can access it?
Yes, that's a very good question. I mean, first of all, I wouldn't say it comes out of subscription libraries, because there's a question of chickens and eggs there. And the conduct book thing, I tell you that's true, but I do think there is, I mean, I've got a long history with the word regulation. I mean, regulation is not necessarily a bad thing. There is an idea that you have to shape the discourse in order to allow certain sorts of freedom, and at what point does that become limiting? As with conduct books, you know, it's to enable certain sort of things to happen, but it's to prevent others. Yes, I mean, that's a very good point. I mean, the quotes from the London Corresponding Society are in some ways rather gratuitously put in there to say there are these reading groups from lower down. They are committed to improvement, but that doesn't necessarily mean a disaffiliation from political ends. It's just the nature of the archive. We have much more material on the middling sorts. It's a kind of middling sort. Well, actually, I mean, we looked into it and say that. I think we went through a period of thinking anything that looked aspirational was bad. And even as I'm saying that, I'm sounding like Tony Blair. It depends what you mean by aspiration. There's clearly a form, a commitment to improvement among certain members of the working class, which does not mean leaving the rest of your class behind you and aspiring to moving up the social scale. It is a notion of improvement, as with the LCS claim book set, which will reform society from below. If you read the whole of that essay, it's only a page and a half in the Moral and Political magazine. That's there. So I think it's a very good point. We want to find more of them. I suspect the nature of the archive, but although talking to Rona Brown, people in Glasgow, it may be that there's more Scottish material on that. Shall I move swiftly on that? Okay, Bristol, part 2. So, if the database is largely concerned with tracking the formation of clubs and the formation of institutions, their members, etc., etc., the project more generally is interested in what went on in these clubs and societies. Okay, we can get something of a sense of that in the database by telling you where they met, how often they met. But that kind of social warp and weft is never going to quite be captured in the database. It's the kind of thing we're talking about. We may get a project that enables you to map networks, but other sorts of work will have to be done on what goes on within these networks. So I'm interested in the kinds of documents and texts they circulated and produced and how they related to each other. And that includes things like this, can't see that on film, but printed cards relating to the club, but also, as with the Society of Gentlemen Exeter, collections of poems and essays that came directly out of the club. Possibly evenings at home should be considered the same sort of thing. If we consider the open sociability at Warrington Academy, a kind of club or society, that would be the same thing. So in this portion of the presentation, I'm going to introduce a book club or reading society that seems to have operated in Bristol circa 1800 to 1822, although it may have originated earlier and carried on later. And I'm really in some ways just presenting you two documents from the archive, because my knowledge of the society comes from two documents. One is the Baptist Joseph Asher's diary, now at Regent's Park College, Oxford, and a verse letter from the bookseller Isaac James, probably to his associate Joseph Cottle. It's transcribed in a notebook in the Bodleian Library, along with a series of other letters from Joseph Cottle, now best known as the original publisher of Wordsworth and Coleridge's Lyrical Ballads of 1798. As I've already said, I'm keen for this last fact not to overwhelm what follows, although there are things to say about the relationships between these circles in terms of friendship, I think, which overlaps with some of the material called in Felicity and David's book on questions of Coleridge's early friendships, and I'm going to return to that in my final section. So when we come to the questions about this section, if you ask me a question about Coleridge or Southey, I should simply turn my face to the wall and ask you to wait till later. So let's begin with Asher's diary. It's one of those frustrating 18th century diaries, like Godwin's diary, that doesn't say very much. Sunday morning, attended prayer meeting, 10:30, Dr. Ireland, 1 Samuel 10 and 26, he quotes from the biblical text, Mr. Page, 1 Corinthians, evening, Dr. Ireland, blah, blah, blah. But at the top, July the 31st, 1801, Friday evening, attended the first monthly meeting of the Book Society at Mr. James's, Wine Street, brackets, sale of books. Okay. Interestingly, in terms of, I think you get something in a sense of Asher's concerns. About the prayer meeting, we get the biblical text and something what was said about them. You don't get told what happens at the Book Society meeting, apart from the fact there was a sale of books. The entries are very brief. They start with the entry for July the 31st, when Ash writes, quote, attended for the first time, etc., as I've said. But brief as it is, the entry suggests a few things. First, it looks to me that the society has pre-existed Ash's attendance. It is his first visit. Secondly, it is not a book society that has been brought into existence to build up a stock of books towards a subscription library because they're having a sale. And in fact, Bristol already had a flourishing subscription library at the time. It was not far from James's shop in Wine Street, in which Isaac James, at least, was himself a member. So he was both, Isaac James, who's running this book society, was also a member of the Bristol Library. He didn't want for books. I'd suggest that piece of evidence, although it's circumstantial, pushes me towards thinking this is a convivial discussion society. Isaac James doesn't probably want for books. The host of that first meeting, then, Isaac James, is almost certainly Isaac James, who was a bookseller and classics tutor at the Bristol Baptist Academy, which actually itself had a very impressive library, so he really did not want for books. You can, I think every item in that library is available for, well, not individually available for inspection, it is listed in the Dissenting Academy.
Yeah, well, they printed the catalogue at the time.
And so James really doesn't need for books, is another boring entry. And he had only recently moved into his address in Wine Street, as this advert from the Bristol Gazette shows, which also mentions that he had actually, having removed the circulating library from North Street to number 10 Wine Street. So it looks as though in his shop he's running a circulating library, but also running an evening book society for his mates, or at least those he has some closer kind of association with that's not purely commercial. Did the stock overlap, is a question we might ask. Was the meeting in James's home or in the shop? As I think you may know, and if you worked on Joseph Johnson, there's a big issue about did you socialise with him downstairs or did you get invited to the dinners upstairs? Was it in the shop? Was it upstairs? Bookshop sociability, where authors and buyers intermingled, was a typical feature of the period, which, if nothing else, helped booksellers find authors and sales. I think this circumstantial evidence suggests that this club did not meet only in order to provide access to books. It seems to have had a more convivial or social idea behind it. Ash attended the annual dinner on August the 14th, held at the Montague Tavern, an event in a rare moment of expansiveness he described as, quote, a very comfortable and pleasant meeting. That is as excitable as Joseph Ash gets. 14 members were present, according to the diary, the kind of manageable number I've already said that was usually taken to make for friendly discussion. Actually, interestingly, a lot more than we usually think makes for manageable conversation. You know, people usually think, well, it's 2 or 3. 12 to 14 is what they usually seem to think makes for friendly discussion. The meeting seemed to have gone on for about 3 hours, judging by Ash's diary. There's no mention of papers being read, but the fact Ash sometimes used the term reading society may suggest they gathered to discuss what they read, although not necessarily. Think anything else link James and Ash? Well, both were committed Baptists, both attended Broadmead Baptist Church, closely associated with Baptist Academy where James taught. Ash was the son of John Ash, Baptist minister of Pershore until his death in 1779, and Joseph, that is the son, had only moved to Bristol from Birmingham in 1795. Isaac James was from an old Bristol Baptist family, and Ash and James were also involved together in the Bristol Education Society, launched in the 1770s by Hugh and his son Caleb Evans as a means of increasing financial support for training ministers. 8 days after he attended the first meeting of the Book Society, Joseph heard a Mr. Cooper of Tunbridge preach at the Education Society. The diary has much more to say about prayer meetings and the Education Society, what we might call strictly Baptist sociability than the Book Society. But James too was closely involved with publishing with dissent and dissenting theology. In 1798, James had published John Witherspoon's series of letters on education, with a preface praising Yale's president. John Witherspoon was a Scotsman who left to become president of Yale. He will, as I'm sure you know, is the only clergyman who signed the Declaration of Independence, I think. But cut that from the film if it's not true. I shouldn't be breaking the fourth wall like this, should I?
No.
Anyway. Earlier with Joseph Cottle, James had published Isaiah Burt's A Vindication of the Baptist, 1793, and he and Cottle were also part of the conjure that published John Ryland, the Baptist preaching superstar, The Certain Increase of the Glory and Kingdom of Jesus, a sermon preached at Chard in Somersetshire on a Wednesday evening, July the 11th, 1794, and at least 2 other sermons published by Ryland in the 1790s. A lot of dissenting book production was that kind of thing. It was sermons, that's a lot of its print investment. Ash heard Ryland read some letters from India at a prayer meeting in October 1801, and the work of the Baptist Missionary Society was very important to him, judging by the diary. And Bristol was a major centre for the Baptist missionary work that went out to India. Notwithstanding that this diary is a record of busy Baptist sociability, it's not very forthcoming. Ash often worried about his besetting sinfulness, and depressive is how his biographer in the Baptist Quarterly puts it. Often the diary simply says, close at business until 8. And he was a linen draper who made frequent trips around the West Country. And in fact, you know, we've been talking about this already. You can see that the networks of his trips are the networks of Baptist meeting houses around the country. And he clearly moves across kind of commercial networks that are also networks in a larger sense, or perhaps a smaller sense, in other senses anyway. Indeed, so intense was his business work that he couldn't keep a journal between 1803 and 9. There were no journal entries between 1803 and 9. On May the 28th, 1802, he is so close at business that he is unable to get to the Book Society until after 8. We know it starts at 6, so it goes on from 6 till at least 9, I think. It's a 3-hour meeting. Again, suggests they're not just going to collect books, there is some sort of sociable activity going on there. In 1820, he mentions, with what comes across as disappointment, having to leave a meeting at the Society of Mr. Talbot's because, quote, of an appointment on particular business. One event he mentions as a treat was a visit to the Society, also in 1820, by another Baptist superstar, Mr. Robert Hall. He says, it was a treat indeed. The second most enthusiastic. Hall actually was a preacher praised by Coleridge to the bookseller Benjamin Flower for the perfection of his style in 1796, and he had left Broadmead Chapel to preach at Cambridge in the early 1790s. So people go out of the circle of sociability to work at the chapels, and they continually spiral back on visits or whatever, and they will attend the book club and they come back. The evidence suggests that the Book Society was strongly and probably exclusively Baptist in orientation, conforming to the monthly magazine's implications about the association between dissent and reading societies, in the same way perhaps that Kibworth was related to the dissenting academy close by, although it does seem to be a Baptist book society rather than a dissenting book society in any larger sense. What kind of thing did they discuss? Was it secular religious texts, or only the religious matters that seem to be Ash's principal concern, judging by the careful notes he made about prayer meetings and other things? Were the relationships of the book club primarily centred around religious affinities, as the common membership of the Broadmead Bristol Chapel suggests? On September the 16th, 1800, just a few weeks before Ash first went to the Reading Society, the radical Baptist minister James Pacino had written to it's only a bit from the end of this letter. The radical Baptist minister James Pacino had written to Isaac James as his, quote, dear friend, lamenting the fact he had missed him on a recent visit to Bristol. He quickly got on to the millenarian intervention of contemporary history, for which he had become notorious over the previous decade. Indeed, he tells James about one of the attacks on his work. Quote, he, that's the reviewer of Pacino's work, makes Pope and Turk good sort of folk and the French Antichrist, etc. This is a very chatty letter that has its middle section all about millenarian radical interpretations of the book of Revelation. It ends, as I said, in a chatty way. In haste and, quote, true friendship. My wife joins in salutation to you and Mrs. James. Remind me to Dr. Ryland and his good lady, to friend Lowell and his charming wife. He is to set Mr. Winter and myself down as subscribers for his book, and the rest of the names Mrs. Friend will send him. So there, this sort of back to sociability, also providing subscribers for each other's publications. One wonders whether the Baptist friends at the Book Society, who gathered at James's shop, discussed the millenarian implications of biblical text, as Bacino discusses it with James in his letter, and whether it bound them into an exclusively Baptist kind of fraternity for reason of religion and politics. And one of the other few outbursts in Ash's diary comes with the Peace of Amiens, which he celebrates with an exhortation, or at least what passes with him as an exhortation. Certainly, it seems as if they rallied around Lowell, as Pacino promises. Was there to friend Lowell and his charming wife, he used to set Mr. Winter and myself down as subscribers. The published version of Lowell's sermons of 1801, which was published by Joseph Cottle and his partner Biggs, who had published Lyrical Ballads, includes many familiar names from Bristol's Baptist community, including Isaac James, Cottle himself, Henry James, who also attended the Book Society, the star preachers Robert Hall and John Rylands, I've already mentioned. It's also worth noting that 3 reading societies subscribed, including the Book Club, Bury, Suffolk, the Book Society at Reverend Atkinson's Vestry, it must have been a bit cramped, I think, Ipswich, and a reading society also at Ipswich. Possibly it was at such gatherings that the idea for publishing the sermons began. For Lowell introduced them by saying, this volume of sermons owes its existence principally to the partiality of friendship, unquote. And Lowell had moved to Bristol permanently from Suffolk in 1799, taking up the chapel at Bridge Street until 1823. It's no coincidence that those subscribers are from Ipswich reading societies. He's moved from Sussex to Bristol, and that loyalty stays there in the subscription list, to that connection. Possibly he was even a participant at Ash's Reading Society, given that everybody else I mentioned had a connection with Broadmead. Quickly to my second document, that's the letter I should have shown before. This is Isaac James's poem transcribed by Cottle. There's the untranscribed version, which is evidence of my shaky hand in the archive, but there's the transcribed version, which I think you've already seen. It's an undated verse letter from Isaac James, bound up with other letters to his sometime business partner Cottle in the Bodleian. I won't read it out, I think you've already read it yourselves in your comfortable homes. I strongly suspect that this is a transcription of a card of the sort that John Freed put around. You know, the ones I showed you earlier, that have exactly that kind of thing about them. This is transcribed, i.e. somebody's copied it out. It's possible it was just sent in a letter, but I suspect it was a printed card, partly because your most obedient ... because you could sign it. You could print them up and just sign them then. The omitted names and venue, I think the venue is missing as well, could easily be written into the card in ink. Wednesday is the night each month noted for the group to meet in Ash's diary over 1801-02, when they meet at James's in Wine Street. It may be that the poem is specifically an invitation to the annual sale when the various reckonings of fines, etc. will be made. Informal though their meetings may have been, held at the home or businesses and members, we see they still have rules and fines. The club is a, quote, friend to knowledge, reflecting the commitment to improvement, but the jocular tone of the poem may suggest that commitment is not limited to weighty subjects of the sort found in Vicino's letter to Lowell. And although that letter is jocular enough in parts, by which I mean, the Vicino letter is an odd mix of kind of millenarian radicalism and quite friendly chattiness, say, give my best to your wife, etc., etc. So the mixing you get in this poem of the serious and the jocular is not unusual, I think, of that sort of sociability. Note also the kind of hostility to those who strut in trenchier caps. Ironically, Isaac James was a tutor at Baptist Bristol Academy, but he sees this kind of knowledge circulation as different from that, or perhaps different from other kinds of education institutions. The mention of new productions in the press may also suggest the omnivorous instincts of the owner of a circulating library, that, as we saw in the advert, sold tea, coffee and chocolate, as well as books. So that suggests there that the conviviality of this meeting was not governed by some strict Baptist piety, although perhaps I was making assumptions there by implying that tea, coffee and chocolate are incompatible with Baptist piety. It could simply mean by new productions of the press, many new editions of sermons like those of Lowell, in which the members of the society were connected in one way or another. But compared to the stark entries in Ash's diary, this card makes the Reading Society seem rather more like the sociable world celebrated by civic histories like those of Taunton and Tiverton, a place of amiable conviviality where friends, if mainly or only Baptist friends, gathered to talk about all kinds of books and in the process to determine which were worth reading. That's one of the things that sets us up in the poem. Without any description thicker of what went on in the society, it is hard to know exactly what was the texture of the conviviality that went on there, beyond the fact of its Baptist complexion. So that's the end of part 2. Oh.
Got about 3 or 4 minutes ago.
Good. That could have been worse.
Yeah, it was.
I was expecting to have no minutes. So that's just a bit of a deep drill into one particular word. Partly it shows the problem of finding information to kind of thicken this stuff out, but this may not be the end of it. I don't know.
I would like to know about the overlap between, how do you distinguish between book society, circulating library, subscription library? Interesting to see that Isaac James advert in the newspaper where he's also a glover and an undertaker.
Yeah.
So is he making money? Does he distinguish between the book society, which is that something for improvement, whereas the library is something to make some money? Or?
Well, the simple answer is we don't know, but I take it that the book society, judging by the fact we've got the corroborating evidence of the Ash, is a separate small group that meets from 6 to 9 at Mr. James's, although subsequently it meets at actually other members' houses. Whereas I take the circulating library to be a commercial venture in the shop. So I think they're two distinct things. As to how they're different, the circulating library, it's a circulating library rather than a subscription library, so you don't buy a subscription, you just pay for use. You don't have to have a continuing relationship to it, whereas the book club has a continuing relationship on the basis of friendship and almost certainly on religious affiliation through time. The nature of the social interaction that goes on there is hard to know. Presumably, you can simply go and pay what you have to pay, take your book out of the circulating library. The book society is being organised to allow 3 hours of various forms of social interaction, capped by an annual dinner, which I think is true. The sale of books goes on, although I stand to be corrected that maybe the sale of books may go on more often then. But beyond that, we just have to keep digging. As I said, this is kind of work in progress. But it's interesting, in a way, your question's the right one. What kind of different thing goes on there? And they all exist in competing ways. The simple answer is the circulating library looks like a place of commercial transaction where you need no prior relationship, whereas the book society seems to be based on a set of religious affiliations.
But then there's always that angst about circulating libraries that you get again and again in periodicals of the time, circulating libraries that deal in
Why are you saying but?
Because there's that, because it might seem that they could be in conflict. The
Well-
sorts of things which are hired out commercially and the sorts of things which are being looked at in book societies. How about novels?
No, well, I think, sorry, I see what you mean. Well, I think the point of the book society is the religious affiliations and the ties of friendship means, essentially it's exclusive, but presumably it's an exclusivity that gives a certain sort of protection and possibly freedom. Now, the circulating library, I suppose, generalising for other examples, is a purely commercial transaction. What we don't know is whether the stock was the same. I doubt very much if it was, because the circulating library needs to make money, whereas the book society seems brought together by a set of shared interests. Now, I put the Bacino letter in there because it's to James, and he talks about the fact that friendship produced the sermons of many of the people at the book society. So it could be that kind of thing was what went on in the book society. I don't know, that's why I wouldn't give this in a proper paper search. So one of the reasons you might want a relatively closed thing there is you're going to be talking about whether the French Revolution is the third horn of the beast, and you hope, you're not going to want to be doing that in an open form of sociability. But maybe they're just, maybe they were talking about much more pious things, although the Cottle poem doesn't suggest piety in a kind of closed way. So there might be anxieties about what kind of thing people were reading, but presumably James's position on that is that he's trying to run a shop. Cottle goes bankrupt soon after the Wordsworth Coleridge stuff, so it's quite precarious. One reason you have to be a glover and an undertaker and various other things is that you've got to survive. Possibly he didn't have. I mean, as far as I know, we don't have access to the list of what were in his circulating library. It would be interesting if, as a Baptist, he didn't have any cheeky novels, but I don't know.
Just taking on from that, how many other booksellers were there at the time? Because sure, that would be the comparative point then. If he has to be an undertaker and a glover as well, of course, booksellers took on many different roles.
Yeah.
But maybe that would be.
There are quite a few. I haven't done that work. That would be an interesting thing to do. Another thing to plot on a network thing. Cottle, and there are quite a few anecdotal things from the Coleridge archive. It's always been claimed that, I think one claim was that Coleridge wrote religious musings in Cottle's shop on his knee, which is, well, there are all sorts of things to say about it. But Cottle's bookshop does seem to recite literary sociability that we have a record of. No record of James being that. And when James is occasionally met later in the 1810s, Southey writes to Cottle and something about asking him a kind of one of these urban history questions about the antiquities of Bristol. And Cottle says, your man for that is James. James knows everything. The letter suggests Cottle as this contacts with people like Coleridge, Southey, relatively genteel, back from university, and that James doesn't in the same way. James is I'm not sure what word to use as a comparative. I was going to say less open, but I'm not sure if that's maybe too favourable to Cottle. But there's an expanding book trade, there's lots of people trying to compete in it, and people go under, Cottle goes on.
I have a slightly related question to both those, I think, which is, what sense do you have of other book societies in Bristol at this time? Is there any kind of overlap in membership?
Well, originally, as with most things to do with Bristol, it begins with an email exchange with Tim Whelan, who knows far more about this. And at first, we thought there are various, and we're getting into my dangerous, I'm going to turn my face to the wall because this is mentioned in the next section. There are letters from Coleridge and Southey that mention a book society, mention names. And at first we thought it was just one mega book society. Increasingly, I think they're not, partly because everybody mentioned in Ash's diary, none of them overlap in the two archives. The people mentioned in the letters. They're all Unitarians, as far as I can tell, in the Coleridge letters, and these are all Baptists. And although those groups, through Cottle is a kind of pivotal figure, I haven't seen any names from my archive of the Book Society in those letters, so I suspect there are several book societies going at the same time.
And they're quite circumscribed communities.
Well, I would be tentative about that, but that is a perfect point for me to take off.
We probably won't have time for questions at the end of the next section, John.
But this begs so many questions.
But there'll be plenty of opportunities
Right.
to ask them to John tomorrow.
I'll make some wild claims.
Okay.
You don't ask me that.
John, sorry, can I just pause you while I swap the table? Seems like a good moment.
By the omission, quote, it is an extraordinary circumstance, unquote, given that the city was, quote, the cradle of his literature and for many years his favourite abode, the enlightened inhabitants of which city ever warmly patronised him, unquote. Now hopefully the snapshot of the particular group I talked about, what must seem like hours ago now, has given you some insight into the literary culture of Bristol in the period in which Cottle, his friend Isaac James and their bookshops seem to have loomed large. As Timothy Whelan's work has shown, Cottle, with Unitarians Josiah Wade and J.P. Estlin, was among Coleridge's closest advisors from around 1795 to 8. Although the city was mocked for its love of commercial gain over culture, Coleridge's friend's Richard Lovell's poem Bristol, a Satire of 1794, it provided a network of literary sociability and, importantly, access to books that clearly stimulated the work of the younger poets, both of whom used the Bristol Library. And indeed, we've got the records of the Bristol Library, we know which books Coleridge and Southey borrowed. And there's a famous, Coleridge writes a rude letter to the librarian who wanted his books back after he'd moved to Never Story. Typically Coleridge says, you can't expect me to read these books in 3 weeks. I have to kind of dwell on them and it takes weeks and months to get this. It's a kind of response we're very familiar to with them. Obviously, with Lovell's poem in mind, early in 1796, Robert Southey told Cottle that, quote, Bristol deserved panegyric instead of satire. I know no mercantile place so literary, unquote. In the spring of the following year, he wrote to Cottle from London to ask, quote, will you be good enough to send me the plan and rules of one of your reading societies for Mr. Peacock? Okay, there, it's a very interesting point. There's this sense that this regulatory literature is kind of passed from one place to another to use as a model for their own forms of sociability. You couldn't just get together with some mates to talk about books. You needed to find the correct set of rules and regulations. Now, the letter says, the plan and rules of one of your reading societies, and this is the answer to the question. The plural suggests Cottle was involved in more than one reading society. In 1798, Southey told his brother Herbert that a society after the principles of those found in Bristol might help his friend Burnet settle into Yarmouth. So we did some last minute additions to the, I don't know if I've read it. No, that's coming. He wrote to his brother to say, is there a book society in Yarmouth like that of which Estlin, Danvers and the Morgans are members? If not, I think Burnet would do well in setting some such scheme on foot, and I will send in the regulations of the Bristol one. Those names don't record in the Bristol Book Society. As far as I can see, these are a Unitarian gang, of which the only kind of connection may be Cottle. When he moved to Exeter in 1799, Southey found the Society of Gentlemen there a little substitute for what he had enjoyed in Bristol. I've already spoken about this. This is the society I mentioned earlier, which is still hobbling on when Southey goes there. There is a literary society at Exeter, Disraeli Hall and Dr. Dowmond, who writes sonnets in black verse. But they are a sort of monsters in literature, all furiously ministerial, even to intolerance of those who think otherwise. So the door is shut upon me, and I have no inclination to knock, even though it should then be opened. With my own employment in the vicinity of Coleridge, the want of society is not to be felt. The mention of politics here, i.e. that the Exeter Society are all ministerialists, shows how it could be a disruptive element in literary sociability in the period. But the mention of Coleridge as a compensation for the, quote, want of society points to a distinctive aspect of the relationship between these poets. That is, to kind of telescope down what should be a larger argument, what I call a tendency to prefer the intensity of personal relationship configured in terms of a spiritual relationship to the task, spiritual relationship to the task of writing, rather than other forms of literary sociability. I think that's a very distinctive aspect of literary friendship in the Romantic period. Explored especially, or perhaps actually given too much weight by the criticism, most obviously recently in Adam Seisman's The Friendship, 2008, which focuses on the relationship between Coleridge and Wordsworth as the best way into their work. But somebody's already made this point this morning. I think nearly all my points worth making were made this morning or earlier this afternoon. But there has been a tendency in the criticism to privilege an idea of friendship. I'd say that was even true about the inclusion of Dorothy in the Lucian Newell article. Overthinking about other more open forms of sociability as context for romantic writing, at least until very recently. I think all the people in this room have done work that's been pushing against that. But it is, I think, a tendency you do find in the poets themselves. In some of Southey's correspondence, there is an implied preference for Bristol for what he finds in London, however. The familiar implication being a depth of relationship in the regions compared to the superficiality of the metropolis. So he tells Cottle in one letter, I have declined being a member of a literary club which meets weekly, this is in London, and of which I have been pre-elected a member. Surely a man does not do his duty who leaves his wife to evenings of solitude, and I feel duty and happiness to be inseparable. There the domestic is being configured as a kind of place of a sort of sanctity and sincerity, but as opposed to forms of literary production, I think. And around the same time, he disparages William Godwin for the literary sociability that is such a striking feature of his diary. Quote, so he says, Godwin, he loves London, literary society, and talks nonsense about the collision of mind. And Mary Hayes echoes him. When I first came across that quote, I thought somebody might use it as a thing in the back of my book. You know, talks nonsense about the collision of mind. Now, as I've said in my books, Conversible World, the idea of collision of mind was foundational. Cut that, please. Was foundational. The idea of the collision of mind was foundational to the notion of candour that was so important in dissent, and especially in dissenting ideas of conversation. It was one Hayes, as well as Godwin, often adverted to, and Hayes, of course, had been educated actually in a Baptist community in Southern. Faced with this kind of collision, which often just means the unpredictable encounter with strangers or those one doesn't know, but also going at it hammer and tongs in the name of truth, Southey often looked for a form of communion, and I use communion there to suggest something different from conversational or social interaction. Southey often looked for a form of communion between like-minded spirits that transcended social difference. It's an idea, I think, that can be glimpsed in Southey's letter to Humphrey Davy in 1799, although I take seriously the point there that perhaps there's this thing about aesthetics there, and he's just talking about who is the better poet. But I think there's something else as well going on here. I must not press, so Southey writes to Davy. Davy started his career in Bristol, working with Beddoes. I must not press the subject of poetry on you, only do not lose the feeling and the habit of seeing all things with a poet's eye. At Bristol you have a good society, but not a man who knows anything of poetry. Dr. Beddoes' taste is very pessimism. Cottle only likes what his friends and himself write. Every person fancies himself competent to pronounce upon the merits of a poem, and yet no trade, no science requires so long an apprenticeship or involves the necessity of such multifarious knowledge. I want an equal reader to judge my poems, one whose knowledge and taste is commensurate with mine, who has thought as much upon the subject, or else one who pretends not to criticise, but will surrender his feelings to me. I think very important phrase there. But will surrender his feelings to me and follow the impulse they receive. The idea of the equal reader who will surrender his feelings to me and follow the impulse they receive suggests to me the kind of elective affinity that has been implicit to so much writing about romanticism and friendship, eager to privilege the particular friendship of talented poets over the wider literary communities in which they're drawn in their rise to professionalism and or celebrity. Books like Seisman's, I think, privilege such special relationships over the more complex social connections that Coleridge, Southey and Wordsworth found in Bristol. Although to an extent this is obviously changing with books like Felicity's and David's. In an essay in The Watchman in 1796, Coleridge actually credited the Book Society springing up in almost every town and city in the kingdom, without mentioning any particular one, among the positive influences tending towards the diffusion of knowledge. He gives a kind of list. Nearly everything else on the list gets about a page and a half, and number 4 is Book Society springing up in almost every town in the kingdom, full stop, point 5. He moves swiftly on. It's interesting he says this in The Watchman, because The Watchman was backed by Cottle, among others, who provided over 150 subscribers for the periodical in Bristol alone, and whose Baptist connections, less often noticed than the Unitarians in this context, across the country, provided Coleridge with a network of potential subscribers. It's very, very annoying we don't have the subscription list for the Watchman. All we have are the names Coleridge mentions in his letters back to people like Cottle, Estlin and others from places like Birmingham. They probably met in their own reading clubs and book societies in their own towns, Birmingham, Derby, Nottingham and elsewhere that Coleridge visited. And these were probably much like those described in Asher's diary. Indeed, interestingly, many of those Coleridge met, and we know that from his letters, are actually among those who appear in the subscription list for Lowell's sermons. That is that book of sermons that Bacino promises his friends will all sign up for. The Bristol-Birmingham axis, along which Joseph Ashe travelled in 1795, that is, he moved from Birmingham to Bristol in 1795, seems to have been particularly important for Coleridge's subscription list. Although, as I've said, it's a shame it doesn't survive among the other names in Coleridge's letters. So that's Coleridge's situation in 1796, very much dependent on these networks. He travels along them to meet. There is pathways, the nodes are these clusters of Baptists and Unitarians in the town. By the time Coleridge was writing Biographia Literaria in the 1810s, the story of attempts to win subscribers in Birmingham has been reduced to comedy. I think you all probably know the famous meeting with the Calvinist tallow chandler, he calls him, who had provided to the satisfaction of many that Mr. Pitt was one of the horns of the second beast in Revelation that spoke like a dragon. That is exactly the kind of thing that Bacino writes to his friend about in 1800. Okay. As it happens, we know exactly who this tallow chandler was, although he wasn't a tallow chandler, and I think Coleridge deliberately chooses to describe him as a tallow chandler as a kind of negative term. He was Thomas King, who was a respectable grocer with strong connections with Bristol Baptists through John Edwards and others. Needless to add, it sounds as though, insofar as we can gather what King may have said to Coleridge through the recollection of Biographia Literaria, that he was speaking the language of James Bacino's letter to Isaac James when he mentioned the beast and the dragon in relation to the events of the time. My point here is not to lay claim at Coleridge's door for this trajectory, for this backing away, but perhaps more to think about what James Chandler's called subsumption in his discussion in England 1819 of the relation between John Keats and his female readers, who played such an important part in his early success. By 1817, if not earlier, I think Coleridge is starting to imagine a literary culture from which such networks are simply excluded. It's not that they're not there, they're simply not to be seen, or at least not to be regarded as properly literary. They're inhabited by tallow chandlers. The respect that he had for such book clubs and reading societies in regional towns in 1796 seems to have disappeared, possibly, although I'm probably stretching my argument here as I race towards my end, to reappear in the more monitorial form via the idea of a clerisy in the constitution of the church and state. And I should end with one last fact. I went and checked on the subscription list for Samuel Lowell's sermon, and it turns out Mr. King, Thomas King, Birmingham, is there, but he is a grocer, not a tallow chandler. A grocer, I think, a much more respectable sounding trade than the greasiness of a tallow chandler, which I think Coleridge deliberately uses to imply vulgarity and baseness. Thank you very much. Is there a minute?
There's a minute, yeah. Well, one question. There is one.
This better be the question of justice, because it's got to define everything. I should have said that in front of everybody.
No pressure.
Don't you think I was being too horrible to Coleridge? Usually I try to be.
I mean, well, I'll kick in then. I think because when I was talking about the group with special chapter, and I was thinking about the idea of Coleridge withdrawing from sort of some certain forms of conversation, it's something more like communion, as you used to talk about. I mean, in some senses, you could argue that's a version of an old sort of new historicist argument, isn't it, in a way, about sort of the attempt to domesticate, at best, or even to sort of turn into to individualise any idea of sort of national political apotheosis. And I am very attracted to that, but I imagine in practice, that's such a neat narrative, isn't it? And in practice, it's going to be much more complicated and messy than that. And Coleridge is still involved in various networks, journalistic, most obviously, I suppose, you know, in the sort of late 1790s and beyond. So I suppose I basically agree with you, but I wonder, what about the messiness of that?
Yeah, well, I hope I wouldn't, as I said, I hope I wouldn't lose that, and I hope the chapter doesn't lose that. I mean, one thing is that I don't think Aristotelism did. I don't think Aristotelism had much interest in the social. So this is in a way as much about the social, although it often tunes into the political. And as for messiness, I think it's true. I mean, one thing I want to say is, well, I'm not sure that in practice, I don't think in any simple way he withdraws from social life. He changes his sociability, but in a way, especially in that chapter, it's about the way he represents the social, his interactions with it. And it's about and so that very end of the paper plugs into what I was saying about the way that what's constituted as the literary changes. I think that in 1796, I don't think he has any problem with the idea that all these people are part of a community. I mean, a part of a complicated literary public sphere. By 1817, that doesn't sound like he's willing to allow that. I agree that the journey between is a very complex one. And one of the ways I hope at the end of the chapter I'm more generous to him, is that I think one of the reasons I'm interested in communion and conversation, and I've said this in relation to Hades, is that it's a way of as I understand it, culture is not a zero-sum game. If you have anxieties, you solve them, and the solution produces another set of anxieties. So one of the ways I understand that is that it comes back to the thing John was asking about, regulating the space so you can have your goods happen. Coleridge, I think, is deeply invested in the idea of dialogic exchange being a kind of foundation of what culture should be. He increasingly sees the way that these competing claims, including social difference, which might also include social hierarchy. You know, how do we get beyond social hierarchy? Well, one way is imagining it in a kind of perfect plane where the social is actually lost in the name of this perfect communion which allows people to get on. The problem with that is, though, you've evacuated social interaction. You've kind of abolished difference to do that. So, I mean, that original impulse can actually come out of a democratic move, if you like. I'm not sure that's always true in Coleridge. But, so for instance, Kant, who says, you know, we should not be dabbling around in the opinions of others. My whole interest is that is what we should be doing, and that is how you come to know what's true as far you can know it. But if you want to find a ground that transcends the fact that you might be influenced by others or might introduce social difference, that offers you the possibility of kind of universal inclusiveness, the problem is you're going to abolish the social, you're going to abolish the messy, and that's the sort of tension I'm interested in. So part of my response to that is I am interested in I want the sense that it's a solution to a problem that produces another solution. I think there's a kind of impetus in Coleridge you can always see going in a particular way. I do think in Coleridge, but it depends when you date it, I do think that in Coleridge, when he starts reading 17th century divines, right, there's a very real sense that he's turning his back on this Addisonian notion of dialogue, that Addison offers you a version of literary culture, as does Shaftesbury, as did Hume, when he says, you know, we're going to take it out of the cloisters and the monastery into the Addison example is the tea table and the coffee shop. And literary culture becomes modelled on this kind of interaction in those social spaces. The cloister and the monasteries, if you like, what Coleridge goes back to, the literary becomes something like the solitary scholar, okay, added to a kind of Germanic notion of the imagination, if you like. He wants to back away from that. It's no coincidence that saying he hates Addison. He accuses him of the person behind what he calls this loose, unconnected writing. Are you writing this kind of conversation and chatting? So I think that impulse is quite a strong one in Coleridge as well. But I don't think it's simply a kind of disavowal, or if it is a disavowal, it's partly after the goods, the virtues, if you like, that he was always after in the original, but it's just a solution that creates another set of problems and may even destroy the original foundations of what he thought was worthwhile. But there's a level which I, like you, do think there's a lot of truth in that old narrative as well.
I really like to carry on, but we better stop there. So can we thank John again for a really fascinating